I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker. So the movie rests in the visuals, and it's very hard to predict exactly how that's going to play until you've actually cut it together. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue. The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly. And I take some real risks in moving the story along faster than what most people are used to in a movie. But it's a style that I established in the very first film, and I've continued to use it in all of the films so that they all are consistent in terms of the style and the way they're put together and the way the story is told. And that isn't just an editorial style. It's, the acting style is done that way, the visual style. And I say the general idea of having the story be told through visuals rather than through dialogue. Visuals are music, basically. There's music through the entire movie. And even when there's no music, it's a musical decision not to have the music. It's a counterpoint kind of thing. This whole series of films is based on a 30s genre, on a serial. The acting style is very much from the 30s. Conceptually, it's using the influence and the inspiration of the 30s films as its basis, and the most central of which, obviously, is the Saturday matinee serial.
Welcome back to the legacy of George Lucas. This is part 5 of this video series, which will eventually end up being one long video anyway, as was always the intent. For those of you unfamiliar with the series, here is the basic gist of it. If you're at all familiar with the history of Star Wars, the actual history, not the quote-unquote secret revisionist history, that secondhand shit-stained Star Wars degenerates posing as biographers and film historians would have you believe, you would know that there is a metric crap ton of misinformation and or lies that have been formulated both by the media and certain fans alike surrounding the making of the iconic Star Wars saga, as well as the maker behind the magic as well, that being none other than its creator, the legendary George Lucas. And that's basically what this entire video series is dedicated to addressing. More specifically for this entry into the series, see, in addition to that, there have also been a myriad of instances where disgruntled and very bitter Star Wars alumni members, most of whom worked on the original trilogy, have also lent credence to these lies and misinformation surrounding the franchise due to spreading their own romanticized little fiction about how Star Wars was actually made. And of course, who was supposedly responsible for contributing to the greatness of the Star Wars franchise, the aspects of which that the rabid fanbase most commonly praises. And the reason for this, you might ask why? Well, because these particular individuals know that Star Wars is one of the most iconic films in human history, and well, they want their own personal bite out of that history, even if it's at George Lucas's expense. And also because for most of these particular individuals, from the Star Wars alumni, despite having a diverse career over many years and having worked on many different films, despite not being filmmakers themselves, Star Wars is the only project they had a hand in working on which has garnered such notoriety. Hell, it's what these individuals are primarily known for having contributed to, and thus the only aspect of their career that garners them any relevance, attention, or fame in the public eye. Much of this is also attributed to the widespread agenda of both the media and certain fans that like to attribute everything they love about the Star Wars films to people other than George Lucas. So what you'll find is that these certain alumni members will actively revise history in order to cater to these malicious narratives levied at George Lucas, as well as the Star Wars films that most of them did not contribute to. And arguably, the alumni member who was most notorious for aiding and abetting the revisionist horseshit surrounding how Star Wars was made, especially in recent years, is George Lucas's ex-wife and the fanbase's appointed heart of Star Wars, quote-unquote, none other than Marsha Lucas herself, who has garnered quite the fanbase of her own in the years since she departed from the Star Wars franchise and divorced from its creator. More on that very soon. And whilst I have mentioned her in past entries of this series, along with certain other shameless revisionist Star Wars alumni members, this video's subject matter is largely going to revolve entirely around Marsha Lucas. Not only how she's been misrepresented by this degenerate Star Wars collective with a chip on their shoulder, and a vendetta against George Lucas, but also how she herself, for the most part, has shamelessly contributed to spreading lies and misinformation of her own with the help of this very same agenda-driven media and degenerate fanboy collective of wannabe historians and filmmakers. Before we move on, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the series thus far for those who are just being introduced to it with this latest entry. Now, part 1 discusses the style of Star Wars and the nuances of the filmmaking and design behind how Star Wars was made. Not only that, but also how many individuals in the Star Wars discourse don't actually have a clue about the saga they claim to cherish so much, because they attempt to write off all of the design elements that distinguish Star Wars and give it its identity as simply George Lucas apparently not knowing how to make movies. Even though, he went to film school, didn't drop out like many of his so-called critics, was a part of the inner circle of old masters who are responsible for arguably the majority of legendary films made within the past 50 years, one of those films being The Godfather, written and directed by Francis Ford Coppola, who is one of George Lucas's closest friends and was his mentor, who taught him many of the skills in which he would utilize and put into effect when he would inevitably make Star Wars. No, these idiots would have you believe George Lucas didn't know how to make his own movies, and they most oftenly spout this nonsense for one of two main reasons. The first being based upon the fact that his style is not the generic, run-of-the-mill, modern-day slop in which they are used to consuming. So naturally, they just assume a different style that doesn't fit the mold is, in their eyes anyway, horribly flawed. The second reason, of course, being due to these individuals not approving of his later entries into the saga with the prequel trilogy and insisting much of what made the earlier films in the original trilogy so great came from the quote-unquote genius of his collaborators, which, given many of the sources I've already cited in this very series, nothing could be further from the truth. Even though these collaborators, which I've accurately referred to many times as the help, did indeed do fine work, but to just remove George Lucas and his guiding hand from the creative process and say it was all them couldn't be more dishonest. Which is a notion that, as I've mentioned, much of this very video is also dedicated to refuting regarding a select few of those quote-unquote genius collaborators. Part 2 of this series discusses the agenda of the media and certain disgruntled Star Wars fans actively blurring fact and fiction to construct their own narratives and telling an incredibly misinforming fairy tale about the history of Star Wars, how it was made, and what led to its success, which for the most part is based on faulty information, out of context quotes, or just simply manufacturing facts out of thin air to misrepresent accounts from notable Star Wars cast and crew members that were involved in the making of the original trilogy, all of which was actively designed to rob George Lucas of his due credit and torch his legacy to the ground. Part 3 is very similar to Part 2, but the big difference is that it is focused almost entirely on the prequel trilogy, and addresses much of the misconceptions and or lies behind how those films were made that much of the mainstream media and older generation Star Wars original trilogy sycophants would have you believe. The big narrative, of course, being that those films lacked the quote-unquote genius of the original trilogy because George Lucas lacked collaboration and was more focused on special effects than telling a good story, when in actuality, not only did George Lucas keep his style of filmmaking the same as he did for the original trilogy, but he also kept his collaboration process exactly the same when it came to the prequels as well. Part 4 focuses on the lies and the agenda of the media and this same collective of Star Wars degenerates that were deliberately designed to poison the well surrounding the discourse of the prequels before those movies were even released. Again, not a story Gen X would tell you. And unlike the previous videos, Part 4 more specifically addresses the backlash that was levied at actors Jake Lloyd and Ahmed Best, as well as their characters, those being Child Anakin and Jar Jar Binks, and how much of the original negative discourse surrounding them is largely based on a lie. Furthermore, it was a lie that was actively endorsed by the media and this fan collective until a schism of sorts happened with the release of the Disney films, when certain actors and actresses were receiving the same exact treatment which much of this collective, but certainly not all, in the ultimate act of hypocrisy, suddenly did not approve of, especially since much of what they had built their platforms on prior to that point was the delusional notion that after Star Wars was sold to Disney in 2012, and the relinquishing of George Lucas's control on the franchise, that Star Wars had finally traded up.
It's so gratifying to leave you wallowing in the mess you've made. You're screwed. Thank you. Bye.
So for those of you interested, there's a quick overview of the series up till this point. Now, regarding this entry, if I gloss over a point relatively quickly or do not elaborate to the extent you think I should have, chances are it's because I've already covered it in an earlier part of the series, and once you're done here, it's highly advised you go back and watch the series in chronological order the way it was meant to be experienced, because that's the only way you're going to get the most out of this. And to be clear, that's the same way that Star Wars itself was designed to be experienced too.
You gotta remember, this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
Now, with all that said, let's get on with part 5. Since we are once again shifting our focus towards the agenda of the media,
I need you to hold my ears.
which is largely led by disgruntled clickbaiters and or butthurt older gen people versus George Lucas type clowns, who are now writing for said media outlets, or for their own personal shitty blogs or influencer channels, and because their sheep-tarred fanbase is too gullible or simply too blinded by the need to satiate their confirmation bias, I thought it best we cap off how they've carefully manipulated and selectively spotlighted certain comments given by some of George Lucas's collaborators from the original trilogy that, again, apparently quote-unquote saved Star Wars from him, and of course I am talking about their ultimate sympathy banner and charity case for why you must hate George Lucas, the cold, callous, bitter ex-husband, for icing out the true creative genius, the one who could have saved it all for the butthurt masses who want George Lucas and his legacy dead and buried. And of course, the collaborator I'm talking about is none other than possibly the most overpaid film editor of all time, and a geriatric that has attracted more beta bitch white knights than the entirety of OnlyFans combined, George Lucas's ex-wife and the grandma simping fanboy appointed faux messiah of Star Wars, Marsha Lucas. Actually, wait, shouldn't it be Marsha Lou Griffin now, since she and George Lucas have long been divorced? Wait, nope, it's still Marsha Lucas. It's almost like she knew that no one would remember or give a shit about who she was without that surname that she chose to keep. But hey, given what happened, shouldn't it be Marsha Rodriguez instead? But wait, why Marsha Rodriguez, you may ask? Oh, I'll come back to that very shortly. Because the media and this delusional scumbag collective actively try to avoid that side of the story at all costs, because it fights their Marsha Lucas sob story at every turn. But that can wait. Anyway, let's get into this. Now, I'd like to begin this section by setting the record straight about a very common misconception about Marsha Lucas's most notable contribution to Star Wars, that being the editing work that she did on the Death Star battle, which many people, even those who don't particularly like or care for Marsha Lucas the way that some of her most obnoxious sycophants do, still credit her with. Marsha Lucas did indeed make editing contributions to the Death Star battle. That much is indisputable. However, what she did not do was edit the Death Star battle the way you see it here. According to J.W. Rinslow's book, Marcia Lucas and Richard Chew had been brought on to assist George Lucas with the editing on Star Wars after the original editor, John Jimson, had made a huge mess of things. Marcia Lucas and Richard Chew were brought in August of 1976, and then a third editor, Paul Hirsch, would soon join the fray. The editors all worked under the same roof in their own workspace, with George Lucas working upstairs on his own edits. Each editor had a scene or a collection of scenes which they essentially quote-unquote owned, the Death Star battle being one of the sections of the film that Marsha was tasked to work on. And since George Lucas had to divide his time between several departments working on Star Wars, and since these departments were separated into different locations, he would spend about 3 days a week working with all three of his editors, and the other days he would spend working with ILM, the sound designers, etc., which should be self-explanatory for most of you out there, as being a much more arduous task than any of the editors had to do on their own. This regimen was followed in order to maximize productivity on A New Hope, and to ensure the film, which was already running well behind due to a myriad of complications, would indeed be finished on time. This was the way production went on until at least late October 1976, when George Lucas and the editing crew were nearing completion on their first official rough cut, not counting the atrocity that was put together by Jimson. By this point, the editors, who were working separately, with the exception of George Lucas himself, of course, had begun to essentially quote-unquote tag team and provide each other with feedback and suggestions of their own. And then once they had finalized the first official rough cut, well, here's a quote from Richard Chew that may just enlighten certain people about the extent of George Lucas's involvement in the editing process that these same people insist on solely crediting to, as they put it, Marsha Lucas and the other two. Because, you know, there's no victim crybaby sob story narrative attached to the other two editors.
I know, right?
Anyway, here's what Chew had to say. I'd always seen the film in bits and pieces. Only the parts I was working on, or looking over someone's shoulder, Chew says. So the most lasting impression I have of the film was after watching the first cut, the first time, and when we saw it, I was really astounded by the entirety of George's vision. I don't think I was able to get up from my chair afterward for about 10 minutes in the screening room. I realized the look of the film, the thrust of the film, the characters of the film was so uniquely George. If you know George in any way, you had to realize that all of this came as a result of this one man. And it just knocked me out. It was coming from the recesses of George's mind, this basic seed that had grown into 1,000 trees. My, doesn't that paint a very clear picture as to who is actually responsible for everything great about the original Star Wars? Coming from one of the editors that quote-unquote saved Star Wars from George Lucas in the edit, according to this collection of dipshits. So be sure to remember that when certain alumni members years later through revisionist bullshit try to say otherwise and take credit for George Lucas's vision and his ideas that made Star Wars so great. Anyway, the first official rough cut by George Lucas and his editing team ran about 117 minutes and led to a few additional changes and cuts, and so eventually more rough cuts were put together, and then in late November, early December, sometime after Thanksgiving of 1976, Marsha Lucas doomed the production of Star Wars.
We're doomed.
Doomed it forever. How, you may ask? Why, by leaving it, of course.
That's impossible!
She left production on Star Wars.
She seems to be on top of things.
And without Marsha's magic touch, the production of Star Wars went to absolute shit.
If I only had a heart.
What, you guys don't have sarcasm anymore?
Yeah, it's shocking, I know, but turns out the production of Star Wars A New Hope carried on just fine without Marsha's magical presence. Marsha had finished her contributions to the Death Star sequence, but all she really managed to put together was a very rough assembly of the sequence with World War II dogfighting footage used to convey the idea of action to the screening audience and to help provide some sort of reference for ILM to do their work. And of course she did this under the supervision and guidance of George Lucas. George Lucas would then begin sending ILM pieces of the sequence to work on by early December, and he would, with their assistants and the other two editors, put together several more rough cuts, and in mid-February 1977, the most infamous rough cut screening for Star Wars A New Hope took place with George Lucas's friends and colleagues, by which point Paul Hirsch was the only remaining editor on the production, and by then, Steven Spielberg and the rest of the screening audience still watched a very incomplete version of the Death Star battle, without the ILM shots that were designed for the sequence.
Of course, all the spectacular, the Death Star fight and the battle inside the trench and all that was just not even there to be seen. So the reaction was not a good one.
However, it was still multiple cuts and several months more refined than the cut that Marcia Lucas had most recently contributed to. And while her work was important, what she ended up doing was still a far cry from the iconic Death Star battle we all know and cherish today. Alright, everyone understand that? Before we move on, I need to make sure everyone is clear on that. Everyone got it? Wonderful, let's move on. So up till now, there's one thing I've actively neglected to address at length, which was Marcia Lucas's recent interview with J.W. Rinzler for his book on Howard Kazanjian. And as we've discussed at length, the common narrative these anti-George Lucas clowns and Star Wars degenerates, including but not limited to authors like Michael Kaminsky, who wrote the not-so-secret simping for Marsha Lucas, as well as practically anyone else who worked on Star Wars besides George Lucas, is that the collaborative efforts on Star Wars made by Marsha Lucas had been downplayed solely due to George Lucas being supposedly bitter about their divorce, which, given what happened, I mean, who can blame him? I'll come right back to that, but more specifically, the mainstream media and social media bottom feeders that make up this sad, pathetic, and delusional collective of degenerates have clung so hard to the notion that George's supposed quote-unquote secret weapon for Star Wars was his now ex-wife Marcia, who was supposedly the true genius behind the films, even going as far as to very cringeworthingly label her as the quote-unquote heart of Star Wars, trying to pass her off as the reason why Star Wars was so successful and why it supposedly wasn't in the aftermath of Marcia's absence.
Well, we are only 2 hours away from the premiere of Revenge of the Sith. And if you want tickets to the first showing at midnight and you don't have any tickets already, forget about it. They sold out a long time ago. And those who wanted the best seats started lining up as early as yesterday.
So where art thou, did she go? Where art thou was she to save the dreaded prequel trilogy from the clutches of the writer, director, producer, and editor that was her now ex-husband? Then again, where art thou was Marsha to quote-unquote save Star Wars when she left production on the original film months ahead of release because she went to quote-unquote save New York, New York from the clutches of well-known film hack Martin Scorsese? Absolute sarcasm in case you hadn't caught on.
If you don't get physically ill seeing your first rough cut, something's wrong.
The first thing she did was recut the trench run. This included removing Luke's first run.
Apparently not, Professor. Rinzler estimates that the first cut of the film was finished in late October or early November '76. Marcia Lucas left Star Wars in late November to edit New York, New York for Martin Scorsese.
Martin Scorsese?
And evidently the work print for the battle was given to ILM a piece at a time beginning in mid-December. So it's possible that Marcia Lucas removed Luke's first trench run, and then again it's possible that she didn't. Professor Jump just assumes that she did. Even if we assume the same, we don't know if it was her idea to remove it, or Paul Hirsch's, or Richard Chu's, or George Lucas's.
Now, I briefly spoke about Marcia's complicity through silence in allowing this Star Wars collective and the media to deify her contributions to Star Wars, including contributions she didn't actually make and the supposed influence on Star Wars that she didn't actually have.
Get out of the cabin. I mean, I'd kill myself. The help?
And as I briefly mentioned earlier, this was partially rectified in J.W. Rinzler's Howard Kazanjian book, where she tells him that while she contributed to making Star Wars, particularly when it came to editing the Death Star battle, which again, by and large, was under her ex-husband's supervision and instruction, and entirely in line with the editing style she knew that he wanted, which the original editor, John Jimson, was fired for refusing to provide. Now, Marsha Lucas doesn't say that in so many words, but that's where Rinzler's books, not to mention Common Sense, exist for us to fill in the blanks. However, to her credit, she goes on to say that she was not the quote-unquote heart of Star Wars, as so many people label her as, nor was she the true mastermind. And to her credit again, she rightfully gives full credit to her ex-husband, who wrote the film, directed the film, and oversaw just about every other aspect of the film, spitting in the face of the mainstream media and social media's agenda against George Lucas. However, while this was very candidly reported by some, it was also very consciously ignored by many of the usual suspects, who were having internalized panic attacks that their disingenuous anti-Lucas narrative was just completely shot to hell. Instead, they threw on a smile, continued spouting their bullshit, and refused to acknowledge Marcia's incredibly damaging account against their little fan fiction of how Star Wars was actually made, and instead they chose to cast a magnifying glass on some of the other quotes that she made in Rinzler's Howard Kazanjian book that they could use for their agenda. That being the incredibly damning words that she had for Disney's modern-day Lucasfilm regime, which had been widely criticized by just about everyone except the media, and the same collective of clown tots that thought Lucas leaving Star Wars was the answer to their prayers, and were actively defending the Disney films until it became undeniably shit.
Alright, so the big news hitting the internet that everybody is talking about is the fact that Disney has bought out Lucasfilm. That's right, George Lucas has signed over Lucasfilm to Disney. Disney, who, as far as I'm concerned, is unofficially competing with Google for world dominance. Just saying, it's crazy. And funny enough, this news has gotten mixed reactions. I've seen comments, videos, and reactions where people are like, oh dude, what? Star Wars is gonna die, it's dead, oh, the worst decision ever, it's gonna die. Really? Have you seen the prequels? That already happened. Star Wars fell from grace off of the pedestal that it was on in the 80s over 10 years ago. So do I consider the fact that Disney now owns Lucasfilm a good thing? Not necessarily. I consider it a great thing.
Thousands of tears later.
Alright, before we get into it, a word from our sponsor. That's right. Our sponsor is that doughy-eyed bastard right there. That hopeful son of a bitch who has no idea the video he's gonna make in a few short years, which is this video. And what pisses me off most about this is we all thought that The Last Jedi was the anomaly. That was the big betrayal of characters, right? But no, it wasn't. It was The Force Awakens from the get-go. So it changes the context of The Force Awakens. It changes the context of everything. It didn't start with The Last Jedi. It started with The Force Awakens. By its very inception, it was a betrayal to George Lucas and what he wanted. I'd have been such a Force Awakens apologist because I've been like, well, no, I understand why they did it that way. And it pisses me off because now I look at me in my review back then and I just get sad. Yeah, you sit there with your fucking smile. It'll come to you. I mean, shit, assholes like me got on camera, said, George Lucas and his prequels, yeah, Disney's gonna do their own thing. It's gonna be awesome. We paved the way for them. We validated them. We gave them the green light. I mean, I can't speak for everybody. I feel like I did, though. Anyhow, George Lucas, I'm sorry.
However, there are those who choose to remain in their own little delusional bubbles, who lack the humility to deviate from their decades-old false fanboy mythology and tell the truth concerning George Lucas, the prequels, and their quote-unquote savior and quote-unquote heart of Star Wars, Marsha Lucas, and still just refuse to backpedal on their nonsense, and as a result will just completely ignore Marsha Lucas's very blatant rejection of their pathetic narrative, and all but exclusively focused on quoting Marsha Lucas's comments, which actively pandered to their collective of people versus George Lucas freaks, those being her extremely negative, and not to mention more than just a little overly melodramatic and bitter comments that she had for George Lucas's Star Wars prequel trilogy. AKA the movies she had nothing to do with. AKA the movies she was excluded from participating in. AKA the movies that most of her hardcore apologists couldn't stand. I mean, case in point is this Marsha Lucas fanboy flog piece cobbled together by a bunch of, well, it's written above the title, points for self-awareness at least, and it acts as a virtual shrine of sorts to their self-proclaimed quote-unquote savior of Star Wars, and one of the opening sentences of this shit piece actually has the nerve to talk about how he cannot discuss the film industry of 20th century America without mentioning the oh so precious and important icon that Marsha Lucas apparently is.
How about no?
No, actually. We definitely can. We definitely can talk about the film industry of the 20th century without having to bring up Marsha Lucas. Unless, of course, it's now mandatory that every editor that gave a relatively microscopic contribution to every film collaboration made in the 20th century gets mentioned as the true visionary behind the production. And this mountain of cringe-tart diarrhea, written by, well, the kind of freelance internet quote-unquote expert that you'd expect, outright ignores Marsha's comments, nullifying their narrative, and just shamelessly goes on to regurgitate the same overly inflated, tired-ass statement about Marsha Lucas being the supposed quote-unquote heart of Star Wars, which apparently was originally coined by some very loose comments from Mark Hamill of all people, which took place in an interview that this shit piece decided to reference. It then goes on to continuously stroke this stupid narrative's beta male appendage with a series of mentions pertaining to other nobodies, such as random writer from random internet news site calling Marsha Lucas the quote-unquote secret weapon of Star Wars that George Lucas had at his disposal.
Who the fuck is that guy? Who the fuck is that? You know damn well who I am. Who the fuck is that? Oh my god.
Which is a common phrase, copy-pasted by many of these same sycophants, largely due to it appearing in Dale Pollock's Skywalking book, which apparently George Lucas himself has publicly denounced for inaccuracies. This article then, of course, goes on to mention a few relatively tiny aspects of the first Star Wars film that Marsha Lucas had a very loose hand in shaping, before crying a Shakespearean tragedy about how Star Wars supposedly fell apart after she left because the super glue that was Marsha Lucas was no longer there to quote-unquote save and or quote-unquote fix the prequel trilogy and the Disney films, making sure to highlight Marsha's comments on both trilogies in great detail, and then goes on to talk about how if anyone deserves a hot take on Star Wars, it's Marsha Lucas, the quote-unquote true genius behind it.
I mean, I'd kill myself. The help?
Which, I mean, first of all, shitting on the Disney films in the current year is anything but a hot take, especially when you consider Marsha's comments, which, aside from just stating what she knows is popular to regurgitate from the zeitgeist, while the comments are quite volatile coming from her, they are also the most easily observant milquetoast quote-unquote criticisms that one could possibly make of those films. You know, about how there was no overall story direction, the writers didn't understand the Force or the Jedi for that matter, the killing off of certain characters in really dumb ways. All of this has been said before, many times, and is hardly any kind of brain blast revelation coming from the quote-unquote true genius Marsha Lucas. The Disney films weren't terrible because they didn't listen to Marsha Lucas, nor would she have quote-unquote saved them. The Disney films are terrible, and this is no secret, because they actively ignored and spited George Lucas's story treatments and intentions for the sequel films.
They decided they didn't want to use those stories. They decided they were going to go do their own thing, and so I decided, fine. But basically, I'm not going to try to... They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway, but at the same time I said, I'm not going to... If I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble, because they're not going to do what I want them to do. So, and I don't have the control to do that anymore, and all I would do is muck everything up. So I said, okay, I will go my way, and I'll let them go their way.
So for everyone still gushing years later about how Marsha Lucas owned Disney with her quote-unquote genius criticisms, and I say this with absolutely no love for Disney whatsoever, calm the fuck down.
Take it down a notch.
A chimpanzee would be hard-pressed to miss the mark on criticizing those films. All Marsha really did was give the bare minimum, and actively catered to what she thought most people would like her to say. And while I certainly don't take much convincing to believe that Marsha's standpoint on the Disney films is completely genuine, at least from an emotional standpoint, since they actively spat in the face of films that she herself had a very personal connection with, the sheer shallow and panderous nature of Marsha's comments are none more evident than when this gilftard sycophant's article actively goes out of its way to highlight Marcia's incredibly quote-unquote genius hot take on George Lucas's Star Wars prequel trilogy, which, as far as quote-unquote genius hot takes go, spoilers, if you've seen the People vs. George Lucas or any shitty-ass mainstream movie review or video essay prior to the release of The Force Awakens when Disney quote-unquote saved Star Wars from George Lucas, then yeah, you've definitely heard Marsha Lucas's revolutionary quote-unquote genius criticisms before. And spoiler again, it's just as uncompelling for anyone with a plural number of brain cells as they've always been. The same incredibly weak source, copy-pasted, regurgitated, shitty-ass quote-unquote criticisms, but in the case of Marsha Lucas, it's also hilariously ironic.
They had also been partners. She edited the first Star Wars. Then one day, she walked out.
Now, predictably, the Marsha Simp Squad, who despise The Phantom Menace simply for having the audacity to briefly mention trade disputes in a Star Wars film, or because they didn't understand midichlorians, despite it directly correlating to the lore set up in the original trilogy, and also despite the concept being dumbed down for the film's target demographic of 12-year-olds, and most pathetically, despising the film for a borderline sociopathic vendetta against the cartoon Space Rabbit, which, mind you, and they don't want you to know this, they started before the film was even released. Now, these simpletons who hold Marsha Lucas to such high esteem that hate the prequels and hate the now canonical author-approved post-1997 cuts of the original films, well, they act like her disparaging words is the quote-unquote proof that Phantom Menace was the disaster they always pretended it was. They saw it as the ultimate validation because the one that they always said Star Wars needed was the one openly trashing the films that they thought sucked. The problem with Marsha Lucas's quotes, especially in recent years, again, I bring up Gary Kurtz because he criticized George Lucas for not being quote-unquote challenged enough, and these comments were actively adhering to the online myth that Lucas surrounded himself with quote-unquote yes men. That is, of course, when it came to the Star Wars films that he himself wasn't involved with.
You're fired!
And Kurtz is certainly not the only one.
Disappointed!
And why did they do this? Well, because it benefited Gary Kurtz, not because it was true. In fact, it couldn't have been further from the truth. Kurtz told the masses that worshipped him exactly what they wanted to hear and actively enabled their smear campaign against George Lucas, despite the fact that the Star Wars original trilogy suffered because he was the ultimate yes man, as I mentioned earlier. Similarly, Marsha Lucas's accounts in Rinzler's books have her quote-unquote saving Star Wars by actively fighting her husband, George Lucas, urging him to keep scenes in the original film that this same collective insists would have made the films lesser. In later interviews, Marsha Lucas completely walks back her comments and actively condemns the scenes she once fought for in the ultimate act of revisionist history.
I sense a plot to destroy the Jedi.
As far as her comments towards The Phantom Menace were concerned, here's what Marsha Lucas had to say, and here is what the media so gleefully decided to report on to try and twist their little fanboy knife in between George Lucas's ribs. Though I will say, to Marsha's credit, she at least had the grace to call her ex-husband a good guy and a talented filmmaker. However, when you look at the rest of what she had to say, it comes across more like a backhanded compliment at best. A necessary safety net of sorts that the media and especially social influencers like to use when it comes to simultaneously bashing Lucas on grounds that they do not understand, whilst simultaneously calling him a visionary and a genius at the same fucking time.
That seems a bit contradictory, Captain.
But we've gone through all that. Anyway, in Rinzler's book, Marcia is quoted in saying, "But when I went to see episode 1, I had a friend who worked at ILM who took me as a guest to a preview. I remember going out to the parking lot, sitting in my car and crying. I cried."
Gonna cry?
"I cried because I didn't think it was very good."
Oh, this is too much.
And this is what had the rabid People versus George Lucas freaks creaming their pants as if they had finally won this long, petulant fucking battle of theirs. Their ever-precious Marsha Lucas, who quote-unquote saved Star Wars, cried after watching The Phantom Menace. Allegedly. And these clowns are demanding people take this seriously because Marcia Lucas was an editor on Star Wars and the childhood trilogy, and she knows what she's talking about.
Listen, if you want to cry, you go ahead and cry. Cry with you.
As if to say her husband, who created the franchise, wrote it, directed it, produced it, supervised every aspect of it, including the editing, and what he thought the movie should be comes second to what his extremely inconsistent ex-wife, who has provided highly revised and questionable accounts in hindsight about the making of Star Wars, and whom he shares a very checkered past with, as well as an extremely messy and bitter divorce, mind you. But let me get this straight. I'm supposed to care what Marsha Lucas thinks about The Phantom Menace, as opposed to the likes of Ron Howard, as well as Steven Spielberg, who both loved the film and actively collaborated with George Lucas in test screenings in helping him to refine it, which many people in this same degenerate collective actively try to deny you from knowing. Matter of fact, according to Rinsler, when George Lucas used that same exact collaboration method on the original Star Wars, in the chapter that discusses that fairly infamous mid-February 1977 screening of A New Hope, that George Lucas had hosted privately for his close friends and colleagues, including but not limited to Brian De Palma and Steven Spielberg, yeah, you know, the rough cut screening that was put together months after the much worse rough cut screening that Marsha Lucas had last contributed to just before she abandoned Star Wars to go work for Scorsese. You know, the rough cut screening which he no longer had a hand in quote-unquote saving, which still managed to underwhelm several of George Lucas's esteemed colleagues and friends.
But a private screening of the film for Lucas's closest friends didn't do much to bolster his confidence.
No! So the reaction was not a good one. I loved the movie. I was probably one of the only people in the audience that liked the movie.
Right, yeah, that one. Well, there's an excerpt where Steven Spielberg talks about why George Lucas hosted this particular rough cut screening after showing it to the Fox executives who had a much warmer reception to the film, and here's what he had to say. George has always invited honesty, Spielberg explains. He's never said, come and see my movies and heap praise on me. He invites you to give your honest opinion. Now that hardly sounds like a hack fraud control freak who struggled without the presence of his wife because he only wanted to hear the opinions of quote-unquote yes men. Now doesn't it? And then the excerpt goes on to tell the real version of the commonly regurgitated story about how the screening led to Brian De Palma helping George Lucas rewrite the opening crawl. Of course, the part they tend to leave out is the fact that George Lucas would then rewrite the crawl several times himself. And then, of course, there were subsequent screenings for Martin Scorsese and Francis Coppola, which yielded criticism for a mere handful of structural changes, because that is precisely what rough cut screenings are for. And once again, I must reiterate, all of this took place months after Marsha Lucas, despite being married to George at the time and may have attended some of those screenings, she had long since left the production. And going back to my original point, when compared to Ron Howard or Steven Spielberg's far more nuanced and respected takes on the matter,
my friend here thinks it's fine the way it is.
Seriously, who with a modicum of common sense gives a kindly shit what Marsha Lucas thinks about The Phantom Menace, outside of those desperate prequel hater type twats hell-bent on satisfying their own confirmation bias, which Marsha Lucas is obviously pandering to, just like she did with some of her revisionist comments on the editing of A New Hope. And I mean, seriously, she cried. Marsha Lucas cried because she was supposedly unsatisfied with a children's movie, assuming she's actually telling the truth. How does she not see that as absolutely embarrassing for a grown woman to admit? It's like she saw Spaced and was actively trying to emulate and validate the likes of Simon Pegg, and those just like him, as if that's the standard reaction for a functioning human being to have.
The Phantom Menace was 18 months ago, Tim.
I know, Bilbo. Okay, it still hurts.
It was good, dude. It was really good.
So worth it. So worth it.
They're gonna love it. They're gonna go nuts. It was amazing.
I couldn't get enough of it. I want to see it again already.
It was amazing. It was everything I thought it was going to be and more.
I can't wait to see it in 3 hours. I'll be lining up straight in the line again.
I thought it was better than Return of the Jedi, personally, so did a good job.
I like the special effects. I thought Lucas did a really good job.
I think that little Anakin Skywalker, and everyone's going to say it, stole that movie.
Thumbs up or thumbs down?
God, I'd put my feet up if I could.
Okay, fine. I'll buy it, Marsha. Tell us, what made you cry over how supposedly terrible The Phantom Menace was? Rinzler's book goes on to quote Marsha saying, "I thought he had such a rich vein to mine, a rich palette to tell stories with. He had all of those characters." Okay, to Marsha Lucas, what characters are you talking about exactly? The Phantom Menace is a prequel.
I know, it's weird.
That takes place 32 years prior to A New Hope. What characters are you referring to, other than the ones that your ex-husband included in the film itself? I mean, let's see, which characters would have been alive 32 years prior to A New Hope? Well, Luke, Han, and Leia are obviously out. So is Lando, for that matter, and Boba Fett, who was hardly a character to begin with.
It was Boba Fett, which I love Boba Fett.
You want to go home and rethink your life?
I want to go home and rethink my life.
Seriously, who else is left that is of any kind of meaningful worth to Star Wars? Well, the droids, obviously, because they don't age. Oh yeah, there's Jabba the Hutt, an alien whose age is unknown, and yeah, he'd still be running Tatooine like he is in The Phantom Menace. Yoda, of course, since he's 900 years old, he's running the Jedi as one would naturally assume before they were all killed. Darth Vader and Ben Kenobi, who meet as Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan as both youngling and apprentice. And lastly, there's the Emperor, who is merely a senator and Sith Lord playing 4D chess to obtain political power, and well, that's about it, really. Sounds like you're just bitter because you were wanting a whole nother story entirely, which is you and hordes of your ex-husband's bitter detractors still haven't figured out yet. That's neither a valid criticism, nor is it any of your rights to make that decision for the Star Wars franchise.
Did you not say ever to yourself, well, maybe they had a point with this or with that?
The point is, it's like if you paint your house white, and somebody comes along, well, that should be a greenhouse. Well, fine, but I wanted to paint it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with painting it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with me for painting it white. Maybe it should be a greenhouse. But I didn't want it to be a greenhouse. I wanted it to be a White House.
And wait a minute, a rich vein of characters to mine to tell stories with? My, oh my, doesn't that sound familiar?
I don't have people. I'm alone. Solo.
Not a great plan.
So far, not much insight from someone who, according to these clowns, is supposed to be the untapped reservoir of genius when it comes to Star Wars. But hey, people still haven't figured out that just telling someone what they want to hear, like these so-called critics and popular influencers they constantly indulge, is neither intelligent or insightful either.
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent.
It's just masquerading as such, solely relying on projecting your own delusion of grandeur onto every single word that they say that they know you want to hear. Because they're pandering to your dumbass.
You dumbass.
Anyway, let's hear what else Marcia Rodriguez has to say. Rinzler's book goes on to quote, "And I thought it was weird that the story was about this little boy who looked like he was 6 years old, but later on he's supposed to get with this princess who looked like she was 20 years old." Okay, what? So, Marcia Rodriguez apparently has a very misinformed issue with the Anakin and Padme dynamic in The Phantom Menace. She seems to be under the impression that Lucas was opting for romantic tension in the movie between the two characters, when in actuality, there's no romantic tension in the movie whatsoever. It's for the most part a very wholesome bond between two children, really. Like, at best, it's just Anakin, a 9-year-old boy, simply having a very innocent schoolboy crush on an older girl, that being Padme, who was 14 in The Phantom Menace and certainly not 20. So, I mean, that's just flat out wrong right there. Yeah, there's your genius, dipshits. Feel free to take your pick between senile and stupid. And to address the other half of Marsha's issue, he's not supposed to quote-unquote get with her until he re-enters her life as a young man. at which time they are both established adults who develop romantic feelings for each other. Which is just logical story progression, if anything. But you'd think Marcia Rodriguez would know that. In fact, she does know that. She's just likely playing up her grievances by regurgitating this popular quote-unquote criticism from those who had a problem with Anakin's age in The Phantom Menace, which is both completely disingenuous and wildly hypocritical, coming from Marcia of all people.
Well, who on the spaceship wants to know why?
So let me ask, did any of you know or at the very least wonder why George and Marcia Lucas divorced? Well, you can hear it from George Lucas himself.
Lucas is a single father, has been ever since 1983, when his 14-year marriage to wife Marcia broke up. They had also been partners. She edited the first Star Wars. Then one day, she walked out. You were crushed by this.
Yeah, it was very hard. The divorce kind of destroyed me, and it did take me a couple of years to sort of unwind myself and come out of it. And then
You didn't see it coming.
No, I didn't.
You were happy, everything was fine, and there was
happily
another
married.
man, and you didn't know.
I mean, it's 10 years younger than I was. It's one of those classic divorce situations.
Let's watch my favorite part again, shall we?
I mean, it's 10 years younger than I was. It's one of those classic divorce situations.
So, let me get this straight. Marsha Lucas left George Lucas for a man 10 years younger than him, meaning he was probably 9 years younger than her, yet she supposedly cannot grasp Anakin and Padme's wholesome dynamic in The Phantom Menace, which would lead to the eventuality of romance in Attack of the Clones because of their age gap?
Yeah, we called it a bullshit.
Do you still think she isn't just telling the internet detractors of the prequels and her ex-husband exactly what she thinks they want to hear? Whether it's true or not? Oh yeah, and as I said, there's Marcia Lucas, Marcia Lou Griffin, but where does Marcia Rodriguez come in? Well, it's scarcely explained by the media, or any of George Lucas's detractors for that matter, but at least one source does cover it, which was cited in Honeycutt's video. Apologies, I don't have access to it myself, but it's a novel by an independent quote-unquote biographer called George Lucas: A Life by Brian J. Jones.
As the two grew apart, Marcia began seeking intimacy from another man, finding it in the company of Tom Rodriguez, who had been hired to create the ornate stained glass windows in the library dome at Skywalker Ranch. Marcia insisted she hadn't actually been unfaithful to her husband and never had a physical affair with him when she was still with George. Even still, the event shocked George, traumatized him even, which perhaps speaks to the extent he was out of touch with things in his personal life. Marcia asked Lucas for a divorce, and they agreed not to go public with it until after the release of Jedi. While California divorce laws entitled Marcia to half of all their assets, Lucas was unwilling to let her have any of Skywalker Ranch and didn't want to spend the rest of his life paying spousal support. So he instead paid her $50 million, nearly all of his liquid assets, to make a clean break and have her completely out of his life afterward. Of course, being the bitter, vindictive person he is, Lucas then went on to bury Marcia, literally bury her alive so that she would have zero presence in his personal life, and she had to claw her way out of her coffin like Buffy the Vampire Slayer just to tell people about it. I'm kidding, of course. It's more accurate to say that Lucas maybe asked their mutual friends like the Coppolas and Marty and all those guys to stop hanging out with her, and because they had been George's friends first and she had left him, they agreed to his request.
Wow, all that and I'm supposed to buy that Marcia thought the love story between Anakin and Padme made no sense because Padme was older. Get fucked. She left her husband, who made her a fucking millionaire, for some handyman.
Oh my lord, who is that?
He's my handyman.
Really? I've been looking for a good handyman.
That was a decade younger than him. Like I said, this is hilariously ironic coming from Marcia Lucas, which, by the way, is she ever gonna ditch that last name? You cried after The Phantom Menace, you crusty old goat. Dry your fucking tears with that $50 million handout that you did nothing by comparison to fucking earn. Oh, my bad. It seems Marcia and Tom Rodriguez divorced a decade later. Well, I mean, if those two lovebirds couldn't make it, I guess the rest of us are shit out of luck. Oh, well, at least Marcia went back to using her maiden name, right? Right?
No!
No, of course not. She's still riding the coattails of relevance from her ex-husband's name that nobody would bat a second eyelash at her without. Now, on another note, the thing I find detestable about Jones is that similarly to Kaminsky and Pollock for that matter, and their independent, unauthorized accounts of George Lucas's life and the making of Star Wars, is that while much of what they report on is indeed factual, as well as being corroborated by other much more reliable sources, they always have to saturate their work with their own very bitter and obnoxious fanboy biases that often try to paint George Lucas in the most negative light when it comes to anything that he did that simply rubbed them the wrong way or didn't have their personal stamp of fanboy approval, which, if you've been keeping up, is not the job of a biographer to do. The job of a biographer is to simply report the facts and give an honest recounting of history. For example, a biographer is doing their job if they simply report on the prequels having a mixed critical reception upon their release, but to add their own anecdotes bitching and moaning about Jar Jar Binks that nobody asked for not only lessens their work, but it makes you question their intent. However, that being said, in this instance, that's the very reason I consider Jones's book on the matter of George and Marsha Lucas's divorce to be accurate, because he is one of Marsha's most vocal sycophants, constantly singing her praises and propagating false Star Wars fanboy notions about her supposed genius, much of which we've already discussed, and he himself also very obnoxiously falls into the camp of Star Wars supposedly declining with the prequel trilogy since it was made without Marsha's oh-so-treasured guidance. Like when he took part in a certain other George Lucas hit piece that we're gonna discuss in just a little bit. But given Brian J. Jones's very public position on the matter, he would have every reason to give a sugar-coated version of events in his book in order to make Marsha Lucas look better, but he doesn't, so fair play to that. However, there are still numerous other individuals who have tried to spin the story of George and Marsha Lucas's divorce as a gigantic sob fest for Marsha, the poor neglected ex-wife, the quote-unquote heart of Star Wars, the quote-unquote secret weapon, and the quote-unquote true genius behind the franchise, who simply wanted attention for her cold, neglectful, terrible, hack fraud ex-husband. These people will leave out all the important details, like Marsha Lucas allegedly having an affair, and the fact that she insisted on the divorce because she wanted to be with a much younger man, taking half of her ex-husband's money in the process, which she was legally entitled to but didn't actually fucking earn.
I have asked you to lunch to tell you that I'm filing for divorce. I have an attorney who is going to aggressively pursue equitable distribution of our assets.
Our assets? The only reason you have anything is because of my fucking sweat.
I want what I am entitled to.
You're entitled to shit.
Funny how that never gets brought up by the media, or content creators for that matter, while they're so busy jerking off her contributions to Star Wars, most of which she didn't even fucking make. Because that story does nothing to help their Marsha Lucas victim crapola they like to push.
You're the victim here. The wife of a cold, distant workaholic, starved for affection, driven into the arms of another man.
7.
Yeah, whatever. You're not trying to deny him what is rightfully his. All you're insisting on is what is rightfully yours.
Yeah.
And maybe a fraction more.
Hell, maybe we should start calling her Marta Lucas from now on. That or Marta Rodriguez. Take your pick. Now, regarding the whole quote-unquote poor neglected ex-wife sob story that many people love to cry a river over for Marsha Lucas, with sycophantic beta bitch white knights like Michael Kaminsky leading the charge, this idea that George Lucas's wife only left him because it was supposedly his fault for not paying enough attention to her, and because he was supposedly an obsessive, emotionally cold, perpetual workaholic, according to Jones's book cited in Honeycutt's video.
As Marsha herself put it, he was very emotionally blocked, incapable of sharing feelings. He wanted to stay on that workaholic track, the empire builder, the dynamo, and I couldn't see myself living that way for the rest of my life.
But this rationale of Marsha's is also incredibly suspect when you consider the timeline. But first of all, and let's get this straight, George Lucas's only quote-unquote crime against Marsha was that he went to work. And by going to work to provide for his family, he made the money that enabled Marsha to sit on her ass feeling quote-unquote neglected and without warmth in the first place.
I was desperate for companionship.
They went to work. You're a horn dog.
I mean, seriously, if Marsha Lucas had nearly the hand in making Return of the Jedi that people pretend she did, you'd figure she'd be too busy to feel like her husband wasn't spending enough time with her. And that she would have also been too busy to bat her eyelashes at one of her husband's young, strapping handymen working on Skywalker Ranch.
That phony bitch!
Secondly, in the same 60-minute interview where George Lucas describes the divorce, he talks about how he didn't see it coming and that he was damaged by Marcia's sudden bombshell that she wanted out of their marriage, to be with a much younger man.
He talked to you all, poor you.
He made me feel like I mattered!
Again, some of Marcia's most rabid sycophants like Michael Kaminsky described this as George being out of touch with his personal life, again framing it like it's George Lucas's own fault, but this interview heavily contradicts this idea that George Lucas had grown cold towards Marcia, because based on this interview, it is glaringly, painfully evident that George Lucas loved Marcia very much, and he felt betrayed by what she did to him, which is why it sent him spiraling into a depression for several years.
George's wife Marcia fell in love with another man and walked out on Lucas.
The marriage doesn't work. How come? What happened?
You know, she was not feeling happy, and she was feeling, I think, that the reason she was not feeling happy was because I wasn't being able to spend enough time with her or pay enough attention, or I couldn't see it. You know, I was very much in love, and just finally she just didn't want to have any more to do with it. So it was a big shock for me, and it was a very difficult time. It was, you know, you think your life is all stable and together, and the people you love are going to be there, and turn around one day and everything's different.
Marcia filed for divorce and won half of George's money in the settlement. It would take years for both George and Skywalker Ranch to recover from the blow.
And while the workload of what he was doing was understandably taking a toll on him emotionally, leaving Marcia wanting more, as she claims, it should go without saying that the reason George Lucas felt so betrayed by Marcia is because he was putting himself through workaholic hell, all to provide for her.
You think for me it's all about things.
No, I forced all this shit on you. What you really crave is a little Hyundai and a simple gold heart on a chain.
Well, her and their daughter, that is. Oh, what's that? George and Marsha Lucas had a daughter? Why, yes they did in fact. Which brings me to my final point for why Marcia's supposed reasoning for leaving her cold, unattentive, workaholic ex-husband is a load of crap, because according to Marsha Lucas and her banner-wielding band of sycophants, she thought he was going to remain on this self-destructive path for the rest of their lives, and she didn't see an end to it, so she wanted out. Well, that and the fact that Marsha Lucas was, you know, seeing another man. However, that makes very little sense for a number of reasons. The first being that while the scale of production on Star Wars was no doubt keeping him busy, George Lucas talks about how tired he was on the production of Return of the Jedi, which, given the hellish experiences he had on A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, that shouldn't surprise anyone in the least. But the biggest laugh-out-loud contradiction to Marcia's woe with me, crybaby, desperate housewife storyline, that she tells herself to sleep well at night for how she treated her ex-husband, is that why, oh why, would that have been the case if in the year prior to their divorce, 1982, why would George Lucas have gone out of his way to adopt a baby daughter? A little girl called Amanda Lucas, which he had intended to raise with Marsha Lucas if George Lucas didn't intend to retire from making movies at least for a good long while after the release of Return of the Jedi.
Really makes you think.
And the reason I say, why would George Lucas want to adopt a baby daughter, and not why would George and Marsha Lucas want to adopt a baby daughter, is because while George and Marsha Lucas retained quote-unquote shared custody of Amanda Lucas as part of their divorce settlement, however, in the aftermath of their divorce, Marsha moved to Los Angeles along with her soon-to-be much younger future husband, Tom Rodriguez, while George Lucas remained in the San Francisco region, hundreds of miles away from Amanda's adopted mother. And in that 60-minute interview from 1999, where George Lucas describes the divorce from Marsha, the correspondent says,
"When his marriage didn't work, Lucas turned all his attention to Amanda, the baby they had adopted. She lived with him, and he went on to adopt Katie and Jet on his own. He says he has known he was meant to be a dad from the very start."
The moment my first daughter was born, Amanda, it was just like a bolt of lightning hit me. From that moment on, that became my first priority. I didn't think it was going to be, because before that, making films were my first priority, and that was what I was immersed in, and that was my life. But then I realized that this was my life. And then within a year, I was divorced, and it really was my life. So I just simply said, okay, I'm retiring, and I put my companies and making movies and everything on the side.
You didn't retire.
Well,
You reduced.
everybody called me, said I was retired.
You raised those kids as a mother, really.
Francis Ford Coppola, director of The Godfather, was Lucas's professional mentor and remains a sort of older brother figure. Why did he adopt children? Do you understand?
He wanted to have a family. He saw what my kids meant to me. He realized that that was really, in the end, all you have.
He puts his life ahead of his work, always has. And then when they're at school and when they're occupied, George runs a small little kingdom called Lucasfilm.
Marsha Lucas left her marriage to George Lucas in 1983, and the divorce took a terrible toll on both Lucas and Skywalker Ranch. George now had to struggle just to keep his operation afloat, and he says he went into a 7-year tailspin.
My life was a shambles. The only thing I really had left was Amanda.
1, 2.
So I simply said, I will produce a movie here and there to get us through, but I'm going to basically raise my child. That's my primary focus here.
So maybe Marsha Lucas had custody of Amanda on weekends and holidays, but then again, maybe she didn't. But that's besides the point. What I'm getting at is, since Marsha claims to have left George Lucas because he was supposedly emotionally closed off and a perpetual workaholic, you'd think George Lucas would have been glad to be rid of Amanda and sent her with Marsha to Los Angeles, to be with her adopted mother and Marsha's soon-to-be future husband, so that he could remain on his own in San Francisco and keep working, but he didn't. George Lucas wanted to retire from movie making, settle down with his family, and start being a father. He wanted to be Amanda's primary caretaker, which is why Marsha Lucas relocated, and Amanda Lucas lived and grew up with her adopted father, George Lucas, hardly the act of an emotionally closed-off perpetual workaholic.
But all of these business concerns are truly secondary in Lucas's life. His first priority is his children. In 1988, he adopted, on his own, another girl, Katie. 5 years later, he adopted a boy, much to his daughter's glee. They named him Jet.
Oh my God. That's it.
George is completely devoted to his children and structures his entire life around them.
We've always had a good relationship, and he's always been an awesome dad. He puts his family first, and he's not a workaholic. He works a lot, but he's home at dinner, almost every night. He drives my sister and brother to school every day. Actually, he's around too much. He's always around. I mean, he's always coming up to me, bugging me, going, do you want to go to a movie? I've read in the paper that he's like a recluse. I mean, he is not like that at all. Like, we'll be in the car and like people will recognize him and start honking, and he'll turn and he'll be like, hi, and then I'll be like, you don't know them, and he's like, oh, hi, and I'll keep waving, and he's just so sweet. I don't know, I couldn't imagine having any other dad.
If there's one thing that you would like to be remembered for, one project that you have done or that you have yet to do, what would it be?
Raising my kids.
There you go. That's a human being right there, folks.
It's a lot harder than making movies, let me tell you.
Well, so much for Marsha's Desperate Housewife sob story, though I suppose it's still an adequate substitute for toilet paper. Anyway, what else did film editor Marsha Lucas have to say wasn't good about The Phantom Menace? Anything of substance that relates specifically to her field of expertise, perhaps?
No!
Rinsler's book goes on to quote her saying, "There were things I didn't like about the casting.
Thanks.
There were things I didn't like about the story.
Thanks.
And things I didn't like.
Thanks.
It was a lot of eye candy CG." End quote.
Ooh, riveting.
Wow, such a riveting, detailed, insightful breakdown of why The Phantom Menace was supposedly bad, according to Marsha Rodriguez. which basically comes down to an incredibly vague and surface level opinion, which, for the record, she is absolutely entitled to. But this collective, which seemed to relish every word of what Marsha is saying, which isn't much of anything really, seemed to be doing so on the grounds of how much they agreed with it personally, instead of the actual substance behind the words that she said. It's the same with the influences and articles which they solely engage with. It's not about being correct or insightful or substantive for these Marsha Sims and George Lucas detractors. It's all about their confirmation bias, which is actually what Marsha's incredibly vague comments are actively pandering to. So should we take her seriously? I mean, she was a Star Wars editor, right?
How about no?
Okay, let's see. The casting. We've spoken at length that George Lucas cast The Phantom Menace with exactly the same methodology as his other Star Wars films, some of which she worked on.
George likes to cast people that are so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to really get in there and give you a lot of direction.
Yeah. So she should know better than most how and why George Lucas casts his actors. And the only remark she makes as to what she didn't like about the casting was the age gap between Anakin and Padme. Another very popular and recycled complaint from idiots who don't have a clue about The Phantom Menace. So as far as Marsha's casting instincts go, excuse me for not giving a collective shit, since her job was an editor who had no bearing on the casting of the original films whatsoever. And so her opinions, if you want to call them that, only managed to reach his ears because it was pillow talk. Next, the story. Marsha simply says she didn't like the story. Again, her comments are impenetrably vague as to why. Much like others who tend to prequel bash by writing checks with their mouths that their brains can't cash. That said, Marsha not liking the story is one thing, but she's already gone on record outright admitting she didn't understand the story, and furthermore had no interest in understanding it, seeing as she also went on record saying she wished George Lucas outright made different movies with different characters, and thus she didn't have any interest to begin with in understanding the story George Lucas was actually telling. Because if she did, she wouldn't, and so hypocritically I might add, have an issue with Anakin and Padme's age gap.
There was another man, and you didn't know.
He was 10 years younger than I was. It's one of those classic divorce situations.
And she'd recognize that Anakin was written as a 9-year-old for a myriad of different reasons, such as his predisposition for emotional attachment being the core character trait that would bring about his undoing, and the trauma of someone so young having to abandon their mother in the hopes of one day coming back to save her. Not to mention the other reason for why George Lucas wrote Anakin as a 9-year-old, that being he would be too old to be a traditional Jedi candidate, but also young enough that he would not be an entirely lost cause either. As a teenage version of the character, that these people versus George Lucas jerk-offs constantly say would have in large part fixed the movie for them, no doubt would have been and wouldn't have made any sense. But then again, Marsha Lucas's job was to edit, not to write, and she's never written a damn thing in her life, so I dread what might have actually come to fruition if George Lucas had her in the writer's room instead. And finally, Marsha Lucas said there was too much quote-unquote eye candy CG.
You really think you're gonna get me with that same attack?
Ah yes, Marsha just had to resort to the ignorant prequel bash's holy grail of useless criticism. That being the vague condemnation of extravagant CGI in a Star Wars film. That was years ahead of its time, mind you, and practically unanimously mind-blowing when the films were released. What I find most disappointing about Marsha's remarks concerning the CGI in The Phantom Menace is that, as an editor, while she hasn't lifted a finger in the animation or special effects department, she should know just what an incredible achievement editing all of those special effects and animations into the film as seamlessly as Ben Burtt and his team did, especially back in the late 90s, truly was. But obviously she wasn't involved in The Phantom Menace, so rather than give the film even its most superficial flowers, she decides to just throw out a popular fanboy weak source misconception about too much eye candy CGI in a film which had more practical effects on its own than all of the Star Wars films that she worked on combined. And this is supposed to be your Star Wars messiah, you gilf-simping dumbfucks? This is who would have quote-unquote saved Star Wars, according to you? And who should have been in the creator's room with George Lucas on the prequels? Yeah, hard fucking pass on that one. But funny thing about the media, see, much of these reports came out in 2021 when Rinzler's Howard Kazanjian book was released, but much of these reports were reposted back in 2024, right around the 25th anniversary release of The Phantom Menace, which just so happened to make serious fucking bank after a massive resurgence in both the cultural zeitgeist and the worldwide box office, having, at the time, one of the biggest theatrical re-releases in history, falling short of only Titanic and Avatar. That is, of course, until a certain other Star Wars prequel film, which was also celebrating a milestone anniversary, returned to theaters and blew past even my wildest expectations. And of course, this is if you don't count the Star Wars Special Editions re-release, as well as the Phantom Menace 3D re-release, which also made mental profit at the box office. All of which these same clowns said were hated and despised from the very beginning. Yet, while The Phantom Menace was having its very successful 25th anniversary release, certain media outlets were reposting these inflammatory quotes about The Phantom Menace by Marcia Rodriguez, seemingly over and over again in a short span of months, almost as if they were actively coping to try and douse the flames of continued success The Phantom Menace was receiving, despite their continued best efforts to try and fail to make people hate the film.
It'll be a great movie 20 years from now. It'll be part of 6 great movies.
So as you can see, Marcia's supposed quote-unquote genius concerning how she would have quote-unquote saved the prequels amounts to little more than telling her adoring public, as well as the worst of Gen X and the rest of her gullible sycophants, exactly what they want to hear. But sadly, it does not end with Rinzler's Howard Kazanjian book. And speaking of Howard Kazanjian, he and other Star Wars alumni members from the quote-unquote childhood trilogy pining for their glimmer of the spotlight from certain gullible fans who seem to have convinced themselves that they were the true masterminds behind what made Star Wars great, with Marsha Lucas at the forefront, and there is no instance more shameless of them doing this than in the very recent Vice documentary, quote-unquote, called Icons Unearthed Star Wars. Now, the alleged purpose of that series is to highlight the contributions of those who worked behind the scenes in order to bring certain film projects to life, Star Wars being among them. Now, Icons Unearthed has also done this for other popular film series like The Fast and the Furious and James Bond. Now, at the time, without actually knowing exactly what this quote-unquote documentary even was, I stumbled upon it and thought, yeah, what the hell, I'll give it a chance. And well...
A few moments later.
Oh God! Why didn't anybody tell me?
What I came to realize, to my great regret, was that Icons Unearthed Star Wars was not a documentary series. It is yet another disgraceful hit piece designed by fanboys with an agenda to discredit George Lucas that's simply masquerading as a documentary. What it actually is a collective of Gen X nerds, the exact kind you'd expect, who are inspired by Star Wars to make documentaries after having a lifelong pathologically cringeworthy attachment to it.
I'm in show business because of Star Wars. Like, I would be like a dentist or something, whatever, in Queens if it wasn't for Star Wars. So...
And of course, when it came to actually making a Star Wars quote-unquote documentary, the best it could amount to is a much, much worse version of Empire of Dreams that can basically be summed up as The People vs. George Lucas 2.0, which to the people with an appropriate number of brain cells is far from a glowing endorsement.
Worthless steaming pile of cow dung, figuratively speaking.
And of course, the lens by which they are using to retell the history of Star Wars is basically this.
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped our childhood.
Albeit with somewhat more tact and some of the most insufferable narration you've ever heard in your life that is deliberately designed to make you want to punch your fist through the screen. Amusingly, the showrunner actively denies having an agenda with the series, but then again, he also says that his editing staff were actively going out of their way to try and attack the prequels, and that he had to stop them, allegedly.
By the way, it was tough enough with the prequels because I'm 46, and I feel like I'm one of the few people my age that likes the originals and the prequels.
Bullshit.
And, you know, I would get these cuts. I get like a first cut when they're just slamming the prequels. And I'm like, you gotta understand, anyone under 32 or 33 loves these movies and hates our movies. So we gotta be cool. Oh, and by the way, I like these movies. Now listen, Phantom Menace, you know, some issues. Like, we can't be disrespectful to these films. Otherwise, we shouldn't be doing the show.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If your goal is to document history, and instead of remaining impartial on the subject, you go into the project with the intent of flooding the documentary with your own preconceived notions and personal bias, and you manipulate history to cater to your own selfish agenda, then you have absolutely no business making a documentary. But if you've seen Icons Unearthed, then you have even a tiny degree of insight into how Star Wars was actually made, and especially if you've read Rinzler's books, Paul Duncan's books, watched the Star Wars films, listened to the audio commentaries, watched interviews with George Lucas and the people who made the prequels, and who also worked on the original trilogy, which Icons Unearthed and its showrunners very deliberately did not do or deliberately ignored, you'd know that what Icons Unearthed is doing is just like what the people versus George Lucas did, no matter how much the showrunners hilariously try to deny it.
Your like motivation or inspiration for wanting to make this film?
Well, you know, I grew up very much as a Star Wars fan, you know.
I'm in show business because of Star Wars. Like, I would be like a dentist or something, whatever, in Queens if it wasn't for Star Wars. So
a lot of people think the film is kind of like a George Lucas bashing movie because it's called The People versus George Lucas.
Sure. It's just not, I mean, it's obviously not that. You know, it was really our intent to make a very, very balanced, very objective debate around the issue.
Stop! I almost got hornswoggled in that documentary where they weren't calling it The People versus George Lucas at the time, but I could tell from the questions they were asking me, it was an open invitation to trash George.
And, you know, I would get these cuts. I get like a first cut when they're just slamming the prequels. And I'm like, you gotta understand, anyone under 32 or 33 loves these movies and hates our movies. So we gotta be cool. Oh, and by the way, I like these movies. Now listen, Phantom Menace, you know, some issues. Like, we can't be disrespectful to these films. Otherwise, we shouldn't be doing the show.
Anybody else's bullshit detector just go off?
Now, similarly to the People versus George Lucas, is that the so-called authorities on the matter that Icons Unearthed consults, yeah, well, their bulk of quote-unquote experts on the subject merely amounts to random film historians, quote-unquote, not the ones that actually matter, and who have more than just a little lack of knowledge on the subject, are the ones that Icons Unearthed decided to bring into the fray. Or certain authors who have written unauthorized biographies with a very questionable perception of history that's ruled by their own bias rather than the actual facts, and or they'll just resort to using random quote-unquote fan experts and or journalists, which, as we've discussed, are usually one and the same anyway, and who all have the same stomach-churning outlook on Star Wars, which is the self-perceived Gen X status quo of how the prequels were a lost cause without the treasured guidance of the help. But the biggest difference between Icons Unearthed and The People versus George Lucas is that Icons Unearthed was made with the backing of a network, and they actually interviewed several of the Star Wars alumni who actually worked on the original trilogy. But what's highly suspect, but not at all surprising, is that it was by and large only production members who had only worked on the original trilogy and for whatever reason, be it professional or personal, weren't given a phone call to come back and work on the prequel films. Again, with Marsha Lucas and Howard Kazanjian being portrayed as the guests of honor, so to speak, and all of these accounts from the ghosts of Star Wars past have more than just a little taste of bitterness reeking off of all of their supposed wealth of insight into the production, most of which comes across as simply self-glazing that at times even contradict what other alumni members have to say in the quote-unquote documentary, and their opinions on the subject matter of Star Wars, George Lucas, his marriage, and the production of the prequels not only contradict a wealth of other sources on the matter, but step far outside the bounds of what their area of expertise and exposure to the franchise would deem credible. But it all obnoxiously contributes to the same agenda that isn't even trying to be subtle, and that's why there is almost no interviews with production alumni that actually worked on the prequels, barring a couple of minor exceptions, or hell, either of the far more credible Star Wars historians like J.W. Rinzler and Paul Duncan, both of whom actually had unrestricted access to the Lucasfilm archives. Rinzler, who actually documented the principal photography of Revenge of the Sith firsthand, and both of which interviewed George Lucas extensively and likely would not have gone along with this documentary and what it clearly set out to do. Not only that, but Icons Unearthed actively ignores all of Rinzler and Duncan's published works on the subject, including the Howard Kazanjian book that Rinzler wrote, as well as his interview with Marsha Lucas.
You know, we got Marsha Lucas's first on-camera interview ever, and it's like, of all the interviews she's ever done, it's her second. Her first was 48 years ago, and it was like some newspaper that's out of business in Northern California. So
not only is that a complete lie, but based on watching Icons Unearthed, you can tell he's either read the interview in Kazanjian's book, or he has, at the very least, read articles about it, because he ends up asking Marsha Lucas the same exact questions about the Phantom Menace in order to get the same vacuous answers, in order to make his own project look better, or to look like he has this cutting-edge level of insight into the secrets, quote-unquote, behind the making of Star Wars, with absolutely no reference to J.W. Rinzler whatsoever. And Rinzler's work isn't the only thing this secondhand schlock of fanboy revisionism designed as a hit piece against George Lucas. His legacy and the prequels were actively poaching from, due to a very apparent lack of first-hand material, and due to the fact that the story they are telling, in the manner that they are telling it, is largely redundant anyway. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I telling you all this instead of just showing you? Well, the truth of the matter is that this video was meant to be much longer. In actuality, it stretched to about 3 hours long, which included this section about the bitter ex bullshit of Marsha Lucas, as well as the false notions about her supposedly saving Star Wars or having any direct influence on shaping her desired outcomes on the subject outside of pillow talk with her ex-husband. However, there was going to be much more regarding her lies and the lies of others that were shamelessly exhibited in Icons Unearthed, including but not limited to, just for summary, Marsha Lucas supposedly coming up with the wipes for scene transitions as a stylistic choice.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
Marsha Lucas wanted to cut scenes from the movie which contradict accounts she made in Rinzler's book, according to the interview she gave during production, when in actuality she fought to keep these scenes in the film, those being the Jabba the Hutt scene and the scenes with Luke and Biggs at the start of the movie. And Marsha's account just so happens to be in contradiction with another self-glazing editor who also lies about wanting to remove those scenes from the movie that Marsha wanted to keep. Also, apparently Marsha went behind George's back to insert one of the most iconic lines in the saga back into the original film.
Hey, Luke, may the Force be with you.
Which, I mean, there's no chance in fucking hell actually happened.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
Icons Unearthed also attributes full credit to Marsha for killing off Ben Kenobi in the final act, which is merely a half-truth at best, and actually even tried to credit Marsha as having supposedly more insight into how the Force works than her ex-husband, who created the concept. And I mean, give me a fucking break, but Icons Unearthed goes as far as to try and label the making of Star Wars and the running of Lucasfilm prior to their divorce as a 50-50 effort of husband and wife, when that's a further stretching of the truth than the length of the fucking Milky Way galaxy. And the lies just go on and on. Now, unfortunately, I had to separate that video project from the George Lucas series, despite the content between the two being heavily linked to one another. The reason, regrettably, is because the Nasal Company, who for some reason is so proud of this fanboy dumpster fire of dog shit that they've conjured up, just so happens to have some of the most excessive copyright bot protection I've ever encountered on this platform. So much so, in fact, that after re-editing the video multiple times, even going as far as to only use still images for the visuals, the copyright protection still manages to trigger. But here's the real problem. Not only was it claiming portions of the documentary which I was using for reference, but it was also claiming sections of the video where I was using other documentaries for reference, including but not limited to the exquisite Empire of Dreams and Star Wars The Beginning documentaries, both of which the Nasal Company does not own, and both of which Icons Unearthed predictably decides to take cherry-picked portions of those other much, much better documentaries to use for their own slimy agenda in an attempt to fill up space in their own content vacuous series, by which I mean, of course, they take the footage out of context, throw their own little spin on it, and simultaneously having the nerve to carry itself like a professional documentary. In other words, the Nasal Company was claiming my video for doing exactly what they were doing, but without the same malicious agenda or intent, which they just took straight from the internet's Star Wars original trilogy ball-fondling degenerates playbook of George Lucas bashing, which has long been played out since the mid-2010s, and is just beyond amateurish at this point. And as scummy as that is, it wouldn't have been such a problem had my video been made in isolation, because eventually I can dodge the copyright, despite the hassle, but I've already made my intentions crystal clear that I will be combining the series into one video eventually, in order to make a definitive version or special edition, so to speak. But therein lies the problem, because there is plenty of Empire of Dreams and other Lucasfilm documentaries in the earlier sections of the series, which, were they to exist in the same upload as the Icons Unearthed video, would likely cause the same copyright bot issue. But honestly, I'm taking this as a blessing in disguise, because the Icons Unearthed section grew so large in scope, had it been added in, likely would have felt more like an excessive tangent, and would probably fare better as its own project anyway, but I just thought I would give a brief summary of it here. As for Marsha Lucas, if this video has piqued your interest, I'd highly suggest checking out the Icons Unearthed rebuttal, which will no doubt be coming out next. But hopefully this video on its own gave you some much needed clarity on the wealth of malicious bullshit surrounding her supposed accomplishments and contributions to Star Wars, much of which has been manufactured and inflated by the same dishonest collective of rapidly dwindling dipshits hell-bent on burning George Lucas to the ground, with this fairy tale history of his now old and bitter gold-digging ex-wife, who more than likely cheated on him, took half his money, and almost caused Lucasfilm financially to fall apart. And all because she was a desperate housewife who just wanted a little attention, and who comparatively didn't give a rat's ass about Star Wars because A, she left production early to go edit for Scorsese, B, she didn't even want to edit Star Wars in the first place, the decision was made out of necessity and not passion, and C, had she given as much of a shit as she claims that she does, or that people think that she did, she wouldn't have spent nearly as much time cougar thirsting on Skywalker Ranch during the production of Return of the Jedi, and would have been just a little more fucking grateful for her ex-husband's hard work. Not to mention, she only edited a couple of scenes, none of which were the final version anyway, most of which weren't even used, and none of which were included without George Lucas's guidance and final approval. And she had nothing to do with liaising with the rest of the production team. She wasn't giving orders to Gary Kurtz. She wasn't working with Ralph McQuarrie to develop concept art. She wasn't working with John Williams to produce the score. She wasn't working with Ben Burt for the sound editing. She wasn't working with the costume designers, the cinematographers, the actors, Alan Ladd Jr., the Fox executives, etc., etc. She wasn't erased from history, as she and many of her sycophants like to pretend. She was just an editor. One of many editors who worked on Star Wars, many others who, in the most succulent irony, certain fans like to downplay in order to prop her up on this laughable pedestal of being the supposed unsung hero of Star Wars and a tragic victim, and want you to cry a river for her, but she was not the aggrieved party, and she was not erased from history, and here's the proof.
Wow! What do you know?
Not only was she credited on the original films, and remains to be to this day, she is also mentioned in Rinzler's books extensively, but certainly not in the way that modern Marcia and her revisionist Star Wars accounts would deem as flattering, which again is why Rinzler's books are so important and definitive, because it prevents later accounts from people who worked on the film from making shit up and twisting history for their own favor. Though that certainly doesn't stop them from trying. And if you're going to go ahead and whine about the quote-unquote special editions supposedly tainting Marcia's legacy, what little there is of it, well, guess what? George Lucas even separated her work in the credits from the production staff that worked on the special editions, aka the canonical author-approved cuts of Star Wars. So if you want to maintain that stance on the matter, well, I'm sorry, but go fuck yourself. Fact of the matter was, every decision that mattered, everything that made it into the final cut of those films, was not Marsha Lucas's decision. It was George Lucas's decision. And despite Marsha Lucas playing the victim and pining for her moment in the sun, and trying to self-accredit herself with things she didn't actually do, like in Icons Unearthed, one thing she has maintained is this: she wasn't the mastermind behind Star Wars. It was George Lucas who was the mastermind behind Star Wars, who always was and who always will be. And that's why she was merely credited as an editor, no more, no less, and why George Lucas is credited as the visionary, the leader, the general, the director, the writer, the editor, the executive producer, and the maker of Star Wars, as well as the emperor of Lucasfilm. What it was, and what it became, for as long as that special period of time lasted. Anyway guys, that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for staying till the end. If you were any at all confused about what was said here and need further clarification, please go check out the earlier sections of this series, and definitely check out the next video project, where I expand on that dumpster fire fanboy quote-unquote documentary that Marsha Lucas and many other bitter alumni members disgracefully took part in. I promise you, and especially if you've watched this video series, that it will sicken you just how much false and misleading information is plastered all over that shit-piece wannabe Empire of Dreams, and the upcoming video rebuttal to Icons Unearthed will address and rectify most of it. Afterwards, I will be returning with the 6th and final part of the Legacy of George Lucas series, which will be the conclusion to the video series and will be focused on the aftermath of the perception surrounding George Lucas, Star Wars, the prequels, especially in recent years, and what it all means for the future. So take care everyone, thank you for your time, and bye for now.